Welcome everyone back. So we have our first panel, Confessionalism in Medieval Armenia. And our discussant on this panel is Professor Helmut. He's the Elizabeth L. Eisenstein Collegiate Professor of History and Germanic Languages here at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. He specializes in German literature, history, and culture in late medieval and early modern periods. He will introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Bogdan. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I want to express an enthusiastic nod to the organizers, Bogdan Pavlish above all, but also Gottfried Hagen and Victor Norudian as the organizer. Let me say it's a distinct pleasure to be here. Thank you for your kind invitation to serve as a moderator and discussant for this panel, Confessionalism in Medieval Armenia, with its two papers. You're in for a treat, and you already know that. Let me introduce Sergio Laporta first. Sergio Laporta is the Haig and Isabel Berberian Professor of Armenian Studies at California State University in Fresno. He published a study on Armenian commentaries on the works of Dionysius the Areopagite, and most recently a new edition of the 8th century history of Levant in co-authorship with Alison Baca. Sergio writes extensively about intellectual history of medieval Armenia and its cultural connections with the Islamicate, Byzantine, and Latinate worlds. The paper he will present to us today is entitled, here is the read. Tradition. The fight for an Armenian confessional identity in the late Middle Ages, or in the Middle Ages, excuse me. Please join me in welcoming Sergio.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me here today. Thank you for that lovely introduction. Just for the record, I do want to say I'm no longer the Haig and Isabel Berberian Professor of Armenian Studies. My successor is David Zakarian, who started at Fresno State this year. We're really happy to have him. I just want to acknowledge his presence. I'm unfortunately the interim dean of the Kremen School of Education and Human Development now at Fresno State. So I've moved on to the dark side. But so this makes it a double pleasure for me to be here today doing something I really love, not looking at spreadsheets and not worrying about budget cuts. So this is excellent for me. So thank you. And today, I think I might put in this there. That worked, right? So today's goal or what I wanted to accomplish today, hopefully, was start to look at this notion of the Armenian church as a national church. I know that's something that we talk about in the early modern period and in today's context. And that's often linked in the historiography with Armenia's inclusion within the caliphate. Oh, it's coming. Yeah. And with the sort of misguided notion that once the Islamic world gets established, the Eastern Christian churches in particular no longer have any sort of communication with anyone else, so they become stuck in what they do, and they preserve that for the next 1,500 years. And so you get this sort of weird dichotomy of it on the one hand being more of a pure form of Christianity because it's untouched, and on the other hand, it's also sort of an isolationist, nationalist form of Christianity that has no relationship to Christianity writ large, and both of those sort of dialogues occur in the literature. I'd also like to say that this talk is sort of based upon an article that's coming out in the volume with Cesare's article that he cited in his talk. It's in German, so for some of you it may be good. For others of you, you may take this version instead, depending on how you feel. And part of what that asks too is, other than just wanting to disrupt the notion of the Armenian church as being a national church, rather than being a Christian church, it also wanted to look at the idea of whether a national church equals a confessional identity and sort of that tension that's there, because there's definitely a confessional identity that exists, but it's not necessarily a national identity at the same time. And those may coalesce in the modern period. I'll leave that to others, but at least in the pre-modern period, it may be a little bit harder to identify. Although we'll see that there are markers and assertions of both a confessional identity and sort of a nationalist tinge to them. But so we'll look at some of those and also bring up some counterexamples, and then hopefully have some questions for discussion. And then part of this, which Cesare talked about earlier, is whether the notion of confessionalism sprung out of Western European discourse having to do particularly with the Reformation has a role in the pre-modern period. And I thank Cesare for his remarks earlier about a distinction being with commoners and not having to do with the ecclesiastical elite, because a lot of what I'll be talking about today it has its locus in these sort of higher level dialogues between ecclesiastical elites and how they saw themselves. So one of the things I did, sorry, wait, did that move? Yes. One of the things we can say is that there were markers of a confessional identity for the Armenian church that go back, from the 5th to the 7th century, as is often assumed. So we have the particular language, the liturgy is written in a particular language in its own alphabet. There's a discrete ecclesiastical hierarchy. We have the first use of the title of Catholicos in the Nersess II in the mid-6th century. And then the great councils of Divinum and Azkert in the 8th century regularized liturgical practice. Hopefully all those will come up. Yeah. Ecclesiastical life, canon law, and Christology for a large part. And with that, there was a specific doxology with the rejection of Chalcedon in the early 6th and 7th centuries, rupture with the Georgian church that allowed it to take on a more localized flavor, as well as the addition of the formula of Peter the Fuller, with adding the who was crucified for us added to the Trisagion as another identifier. And again, in addition, going back to praxis, there's a distinctive liturgical practice, nativity and baptism of Christ on the 6th of January, not adding water to Eucharistic wine, because why dilute wine? It is not good to do that. And then they have specific fast and feast days, as we heard. So these are the most visible forms of identification, because you can tell, you know who you are by what you do, right? And so do other people. And so in these ways, we have this clear confessional markers of a confessional identity, as well as you have this great, sentence or statement of Catholicos Moses II. I will not I will not cross the Azat River to eat the purni, the baked bread of the Greeks, nor will I drink their termon hot water. Right. So this great statement. Of course, it's recorded in Greek in an actual Armenian Catholic text. Chalcedonian text. But again, not the. This is not the whole story. It may sum up one part of the Armenians, but it's not the whole story, because we do have plenty of silences in the historical record. First of all, from the simple believers, as Jacques Tanous calls them, or the commoners. We have no idea what they were doing or thinking or saying, or whether they had any relationship. I take as an example here the history of Revond as well, written in the 8th century. He makes no mention whatsoever of any religious controversy. Here's a major historiographical work. There is the letter of Umar and Leo, the correspondence of them inserted into the text. That's not by him. We argue that he did put it there. But if you take that letter outside, which is also a bit of a strange letter since it shows iconoclastic tendencies that Revon doesn't share elsewhere, and it seems to be translated from Greek. If you remove that, none of the great controversies are mentioned at all in this really our only important 8th century historical source, right? Doesn't talk about the iconoclastic controversy at all. Doesn't talk about the councils of Divin or Monastir. Doesn't mention Chalcedon, right? So here we have a whole text about Armenian history that really doesn't pay attention to the religious side of things as well. Plus, we can assume that there are plenty of non-Christians still running around Armenia, from whom we don't know anything. And probably one of the greatest, I would say, examples of control, the Armenian church monopolized the Armenian alphabet. We have no non-Armenian Christian writing in Armenian, and we have very little heretical writing even in Armenian. The church was able to control it either they destroyed it if it was written, or nobody was able to have access to that technology of the Armenian alphabet if they weren't already embedded within the hierarchy at some level. So that's a pretty remarkable achievement. But we do know, from other languages that there were other confessions. The most famous example here is the Narratio de Rebus Armeniae from around 700 CE, originally written in Armenian and then translated into Greek. The Armenian has been lost, but that gives an alternative history of Armenian Christianity from the pro-Chalcedonian position. But here, what I did want to mention is it talks about the faith of Saint Gregory, right, of Gregory the Illuminator, who is seen as the prototypical Armenian Chalcedonian, and then used in later polemical texts by Chalcedonians as the harbinger of Armenian Chalcedonism. And so that makes a marked contrast to how St. Gregory is later viewed. Now, Armenians also, I've made my own mistake, right? So Armenian apostolics who are anti-Chalcedonian also claim St. Gregory as their own. And we see this sort of argument going back and forth about who is actually preserving the faith of St. Gregory. I think it's also important to note that prior to this sort of interaction, it was more common for people writing in Armenian to talk about their preserving the faith of Jerusalem rather than of St. Gregory. And it's sort of around this time in the 7th and 8th centuries, around 700, that we start to see the faith of St. Gregory replace the faith of Jerusalem as the standard bearer of what Armenian Christianity represents. Okay. Now, if we're going to fast forward here, I've got to international churches in this sense, and this is from a text that I particularly like. It's by Bohos Daronetsi, and this is from the beginning of the 11th century. So it's technically, after Byzantium has lost to the Seljuk Turks at the Battle of Manazkert, but before the full effect of what that means for particularly the Armenians has come into effect. And there's already Armenian Chalcedonians writing to some of the little states that have been left after Manazkert, saying, like, you should join with the Chalcedonian cause. And Bohos Daronetsi decided to write a rejoinder to one of these that was written he was asked to write a rejoinder. And one of the things that I thought this was interesting is preserved in this manuscript is that he talks about the ability of translating, or the willingness to translate. And he says that the Romans, i.e. here the Greeks, disparage the Armenians because they translate books and learn from the Romans. And he goes on, he says, there are many books among Armenians, but the Romans do not translate them because of laziness and pride. So the Bohos is setting up the Armenians as superior to the Greeks in that they know what's in their work, but the Greeks don't know the opposite. So he says, we translate the books of the Holy Fathers and the discourses of the Holy Martyrs from the Syrians and the Egyptians, from the Romans and from the Greeks. And here he's using Romans as Latins. As well as many from the heretics, which are equal to the Orthodox. For the Holy Athanasius, I won't quote all of that. But then it says, so too, the Armenians gather the useful bits from all the crap and discard the worthless ones. So he has this notion that one of the things that makes Armenians unique is the fact that they do have this ability to read in other languages, but then they sort through them to take what they need from them. And there's probably Virgilian overtones here in the Aeneid where they talk about it, but we won't get into that right now. But this sort of tension that we see, that on the one hand, there's a recognition that other people have worthy things, but we have to make them our own or adapt them, continues on in Armenian Latin interactions as well, particularly in Cilicia, where there's what I've called elsewhere confessional ambiguity, people sort of saying, yeah, we'll do whatever the Latins say, particularly amongst the monarchy, but then not doing that. Trying to play both sides, being able to navigate between. It's sort of almost an early, I don't know if it would go so far as an early Mechiturist stance, but there are people who try to argue that no, everything that's coming out from the Latin Church is in agreement with the Armenian tradition. But then there are new things like the Filioque controversy that come up, that the Armenians eventually reject, but at first adopt. So it goes back and forth. And then we have Mechitar Skevratsi arguing in the 1260s with the Latin congregation saying, why are you asking us to change to you? You should be changing to us. There's a background to this in terms of Mongol, how strong the Mongols are at the time. And a lot of the discussion revolves around that. But then we have these two councils that also try to push towards union with Rome, and any sort of negation of that is forcibly disbanded. That's what's happening in Cilicia. Oh, sorry. But in Greater Armenia, we have the region of Syunik that is, I'm just getting it all up. The region of Syunik that is also pushing a different line. It's trying to push the anti-Chalcedonian line. And we have Stepanos Orbelian, the metropolitan bishop there, referring to the Armenian Catholicos as general father of the race of Haik. Right? And this is probably one of the strongest examples of a confessional identity, where he actually talks about how the Catholicos of the Armenians rules all the Armenian people. Right. And he goes through a review of, this is not unusual, but he does go through a review of all the earlier church councils, thus placing his position within a tradition. Right. And then he says, we'd rather go to hell with our ancestors than to heaven with the Romans. Right. That's probably the clearest statement you'll ever get of confessional identity that you can find in the pre-modern period. But we have to say that this was also signed by 6 bishops, 4 vartapets, and members of 2 local noble families of the area. And so part of what I argue is that this isn't like an assertion of what the tradition is. It's a claim to this region that has recently become prominent thanks to the money it's made from the Mongol, the Pax Mongolica. It's a claim that they are the actual true bearers of the Armenian tradition, and they're the ones who get to decide, not the people in Cilicia on the coast. They're also aggravated by the arrival of Latin missionaries, particularly the Franciscans, and then the Dominicans who take over, who start pushing conversion amongst Armenians, and they're particularly active in Nakhchivan and Syunik, those 2 regions, and they're quite successful. A number of Armenians do convert, and that provides, that's also eating into the prestige of these Armenian monks, and so they obviously push back. Now, having said that, dispute and disagreements were accepted in many of the monasteries. And we can pick in this place in Erzinga, Mount Sepu, we can see in the Scholia there on Dionysius that it says that one must not offend the rule of another nor labor to hinder it. If it does not seem good to you, it may seem good to another, for it is for the sake of the truth. Right, so that we can see that there's an openness to this sort of differences in religious practice and in religious thought. So it's not as if that which is not in your religious conduct must be false. For religious conduct exists which is not like yours and is not false, but it is true religious conduct. That's a pretty advanced statement for the time, I think. This was not shared, obviously, everywhere, but it definitely... and definitely does exist within the Armenian tradition as well. And there's the sort of but back in the in Syunik, where the Unitor movement was founded, we start to get even more sort of reification of these boundary lines, particularly with the formation of an Armenian Inquisition under Hovhannes Voronetsi and Machakia Khirmetsi. Physical torture was used in punishment, and they got the support of local ruling authorities as well. Interestingly enough, they don't seem to touch the missionaries themselves. They only touch Armenian converts. Also, they don't destroy the books. They only destroy the people. All right, they say we won't destroy the books, because they said the books are actually quite useful. But that's after they killed the converts who refused to come back to what they decide is Armenian apostolicity. And part of one of the questions that I wanted to ask is I think that it's part of the reification of these boundaries that allows for the incorporation of more Latin ideas and texts within the Armenian tradition. It sort of seems, I would say, contradictory, but the I think the firmer the boundaries became, the actual ability to incorporate foreign ideas became easier because you knew what you could take in and what you couldn't. And so that was something we can see this. Hovhannes Vodanessi reforms the Armenian education system based on the Logica Vedas of the Dominicans. And Grigor Tatavati includes a whole host of Latin authors in his Gir Kartzmant's Book of Questions, which gets replicated down into the modern period as a standard for what the Armenian church believes, although a lot of that is now coming from Thomas Aquinas, St. Augustine, not your traditional slew of Armenian authors. Most of whom are not credited in the book itself, so they won't know that when they read it. But then some of the questions then that I did want to ask based on this was, how do we escape the Eusebian trap of assuming orthodox theological positions and elements of praxis within the Armenian church? It becomes very difficult to not assume that the Armenian church has had this theological belief from beginning to end and not talk about it as defending a tradition. I've been guilty of this myself, but we often see this as defending the Armenian tradition against outsiders. Second question, does the confessional framework work for this period? All right, the framework that's been built about that Cesare was talking about earlier, does that work for this pre-modern period when we don't know what commoners are doing? Does it work for the later period? If it does work for the right, does it become meaningless if it works for everything? Right, then do we not have an actual heuristic framework? And then another question I had was, does the paradox articulated above between stricter confessional boundaries and more open engagement with others hold? It's something I put out there, not sure how wedded I am to it. Also, how do we disentangle Armenian and church in the Armenian church? And what are the most salient elements of each and when beyond the language? Because people mean different things when they say the Armenian church. Do they mean a church liturgy that's said in Armenian? Do they mean practiced by Armenians regardless of the language? Are they assuming certain theological positions behind it? And then finally, how do we effectively increase the incorporation of those voices that have been silenced either by erasure from the written record or marginalized by omission from official compilations into our narrative of Armenian identity formation? So I think I made it there, and I'm done. Yeah. So thank you very much. I know that was very brief. Or very rapid, but hopefully people are also able to read the abridged talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sergio. Ani Shahinian is an assistant professor in Armenian Christian art and theology at St. Vladimir and St. Nersess's Theological Seminaries in New York. Her research deals with Christian-Muslim relations and Christian martyrdom in a multicultural context of late Armenia. Ani earned her PhD in history and theology at the University of Oxford. Where's that?
Mississippi.
Oh.
I've been confused for that. Oxford,
Her paper is entitled, as you can read, Christian-Muslim Identities and the Perception of the Other, a case study of Awag Salmastec, Martyrology, 1390. Please, a round of applause.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Bogdan, Viken, the center, for having me here today. I'm not so sure we don't have a commoner knowledge of late medieval, perhaps. So maybe I start off by saying Awag was a commoner, actually. So not only Awag, but at least 38 other martyr texts that I've identified in my research tells us a lot about Armenian Christians in late medieval world and even medieval world. Oh, sorry. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. And so, but that's just to dovetail from Sergio's presentation. There are quite a bit of Armenian, or maybe if I may say Armeno-Latin relations, even in the period before 17th century, developing in early 1400s, that I really hoped to actually kind of bring it into conversation as a backdrop to the development of this very text I will present today. that Christian-Muslim negotiating the Christian identity in the complex context of the development of Islam in late medieval Armenia is not the only challenge. The missionary activities of the Dominicans and also the Franciscans before that really shaped how the Armenian Vartapet, that is the Armenian church teacher, the theologian, actually wrote, composed, and thought about these ideas. Not only texts hidden away, but also texts that were read during liturgy for the commoner. So these are not devoid of its actual context in a way that actually speaks to the more broader audience. I like to first actually start off also to highlight, I think, oh, I guess I do the clicker, there we go. So I mentioned martyrologies, but before I introduce a place where we can actually see these for themselves in the original copies of the manuscripts, I wanted to bring to our attention a series of manuscripts from the period, 13th, 14th, 15th centuries of Armeno-Catholic relations, where there is quite a bit of large translation, or I should say, a copying of manuscripts from Latin missionaries in Armenia that actually highlight a lot of the questions that Cesar was mentioning in 17th century. This is an example of Bartolomeo of Bologna from 1333. Another handful of the ones that I've been working on are from Peter of Aragon. And so it's just very interesting to see how what I'm about to present in the defining of the identity of Awag in relation to the Muslim challenge, how actually in the background there is quite a bit of Catholic, Armenian Catholic discussion taking place. I'm happy to discuss some of that during the question and answer as it is part of my current research, but not necessarily directly related to my talk. So speaking of Armenian martyrologies, I like to introduce Grigor Tseren's Khalatetsi's Haismavur, compiled in 1401, which actually has a handful of these martyr texts. What's interesting about this work is that it's actually the sources when I actually engaged with the material and allowed for the context to speak and studied it on its terms in its framework, it actually allowed even the power of the martyrological genre to really allow me to enter into the idea of how these identities were shaped, how these martyr texts came together. So a collection of ancient lives of people, many of them had not having to do anything with Armenia, but all of a sudden, now we enter into a period where Armenian martyrs are made. It's a very interesting way to look at what that actually means. So this is a copy of it in Oxford. And I have a few other examples to highlight, but before I do, just a couple of thoughts about the local perspective on global issues in martyrologies, the socioeconomic insights that come through, whether it's issues related to the context of the challenge of the Catholic Church at the time, but also Muslim relations, especially how they engaged at the different societal levels, theological implications of freedom of the human will. So it's not just politics and religion alone, it's philosophical. There's questions of what constitutes a freedom of choice and what it means to be human. So some questions to keep in mind as I'm about to share Awag's story is, what are the circumstances that gave rise to his martyrdom? What were some of the stress map markers that led to the martyrdom? How does the author illuminate or distort, for that matter, the actors and the events in order to actually make a point? These are meaning-making texts as well. We can talk about the historicity of them, but there's also, it's not the modern mind that we're dealing with. We're not writing for fact. There's actually meaning that the author means to communicate. So, as I mentioned earlier, Hill Museum and Manuscript Library has a collection of these very rich manuscripts illuminating the lives of the saints. And interestingly, the reason I chose to display this one for our review very briefly is Sergio mentioned Lusavoric being a identity maker, both for the Catholic and the Armenian apostolic. Quite interestingly, the Haismavurk, the Armenian translation and reworking of Grigor Dzeren's Chalatetsi, begins with the Chalatetsi, with Grigor Lusavoric's conversion story, which in and of itself, if taken for what the text is a statement of confession. All of the various, levels of tortures and all the various story as it dovetails from one from another about what meaning is it trying to make based on the ancient beliefs of what it means to be a Christian in the face of the challenges of not only in the 4th century, 3rd, 4th century, but also now in the 14th, 15th century. So it's sort of reimagining and reframing what it means to believe or what it means to be a Christian. A couple more examples of those manuscripts, all of them which are accessible at the Hill Museum Manuscript Library. You just have to have a free account. And these are collections from Istanbul, Zomar, Lebanon. All of the various Iraq collections are available for view. Just wanted to introduce some of this. Another martyrology with sort of illuminations and illustrations and miniature paintings that help us to kind of the text and the image, as you were very nicely mentioning, speak very nicely of how people understood various issues at in that period, in that time. So for time purposes, I will skip to this one slide here is just a modern translations, but by Ed Matthews. If anyone's interested, not necessarily accessing the text in the classical Armenian, although that's where the treasures are, but he's done, and actually his translations have the classical Armenian and the English translation side by side for those who might be interested. So with all that kind of background, I would like to introduce Awag Salmastec, martyred actually tomorrow is his memory day, sometime in 1390. So if anyone is better at math than I am, 2025. So it's a very interesting sort of moment for me to celebrate and remember his memory at a moment like this. So Awag Salmastec was martyred in Baresh, Bitlis, southwest of Lake Van. And as I share the story, I will move right into the maps to help us a little bit orient ourselves where he was and where Baresh and Salmast were. The author imbues Awag's text, the martyr text narrative, with scriptural undertones. This is not just a historical text. This is a theological text, providing a treatise on the attributes of God, a chronological overview of salvation history. What is it that they believed? So all those statements coming through about what it meant to be an Armenian Christian in this period comes through quite interesting, well-defined for this period. Again, we can talk about the undertones about what it is that it's responding to when it comes to the Catholic challenge or the Muslim challenge. Very interestingly imbued in the martyr text. So in the late medieval Armenian martyrologies, Awag's is one very unique case amongst, I would say, all 700 collections, if we want to look at that, but perhaps more unique in the sense that it is a commoner's case. It's not an ecclesial figure that's being martyred. But also amongst the textual tradition, this is one of 5 in this period that actually makes a theological statement. So it starts with a theological discourse, and it's encased with also an epilogue. It's unique amongst, with its epilogue forming a homily on Psalm 116, which in Datevatsi's Amarain Yevzimarain Karozagit, which is the volumes on the summer and winter volumes, Datevatsi actually gives a homily on the case of what it means to be martyrs on that very psalm. So very interesting dovetailing of them together. So he says that very quickly moving forward, with Awag's martyrology concluding on the theological and the historical data, it maintains not only as a theological piece, but a philosophical discourse. The methods the Vartapet engages in composes text to illuminate the Christian understanding of universal questions on life, death, some of the very interesting things that we have been talking about on what is divides, what creates the schisms, what creates the unity. All of that comes together quite nicely in Awag's case. So in drawing that metaphysical case to a close, which is a longing for the eternal life, the ruling over fear of death, Awag is introduced as a young Christian man who sews purses and other items, including of horse saddles made from leather. So I found some of testimonies from non-Armenian sources actually speaking of witnessing such materials. And I thought for our own imagination, I would use some examples to see what is it that Awag was actually working on. So this is his artisan trade. Here are some examples of leather purses that would have perhaps been what Awag worked on. These were used for, and actually the history on Timur Lanes also talks about quite a bit of these materials. So during his adolescent years, Awag had visited Salmast with his master craftsman, who was identified as a Persian Muslim. Awag worked in Salmast. He was an apprentice to the Persian Muslim, and had stayed with him, which the text clarifies that it was mutually profitable for both of them. The narrative affirms Awag Salmastec had not renounced his Christian faith, but the public was of the opinion that Awag had become a Muslim. Now, after some 30 years, Awag, who was now living in Baresh and continues his work in the same industry, encounters another Persian Muslim in Baresh who recognizes him from his trade back in the day and says something along the lines of, hold on, I've met you in Salmast, I've seen your work, you're a Muslim. There was a time, the statement is, in Salmast when you were a Tajik, according to the customs of Muhammad, and here it happens so that you're a Christian? And Awag's response is an interesting one. He says, I was a Christian, I am a Christian, and I will be a servant of Christ. The Muslims then, here's the interesting figure of the mob coming together. The Muslims gather around the large crowd of local peasants, speaking of commoners, and they drag Awag before the local authorities. And according to the narrative, just for the time purposes, I will wrap it up very quickly, the part of the story, so I can make some conclusions. After various exchanges, they come together to not only charge him with certain things, which the charge at this point cannot even stand. So the narrative is imbued with various theological motifs from Christ's persecution and his testimony before the judges. What was testified, what was actually at the time accepted to be the increased tension between the mob, between the judges, between the Qadi, the judge, and also the Emir, and then now the Awag himself. So to sort of very quickly contextualize in the Awag story in late medieval Armenian historical context, here is on the map where we can see southwest of Lake Van on the right side of the map, and on the left we have Salmast. So from the time of the Mongols and to the period of the conquest of the Ottomans, Armenian highlands in the greater Lake Van region, including the areas of Lake Urmia and Lake Van, became a crucible of conglomerates, of quarrels between various military powers. So there's quite a bit of political and religious sort of history that is very much the background of what is happening between these two regions. What's very interesting from the ecclesiastical part of what is sometimes overlooked is that the actual communities, the monastic communities, the people who actually were behind these texts and the ones who were forming and shaping what it meant to be a Christian in this time were very much, as you can see around this one particular map, connected to the churches. So whether it's the ecclesiastical communities of the monks or the hierarchy of the church that Sergio was mentioning, and so was earlier Cesar, the churches were very much connected to the monastic communities. The ideas, what it meant to be an Armenian Christian was shaping in conjunction with the church, with the monastic communities. Unfortunately, that's lost already by the time we get to 17th, 18th century. The demise of the monastic community, I think, is a contribution to how identity formation also becomes so contentious between various the politics or the religious agendas of a certain patriarchate, so to speak. So there is a disconnect between the monastery and the church. Very quick, as I try to conclude, is to identify some of the demographic shifts also that's taking place at the time in both of these communities. And then perhaps I can leave the slide for discussion on the questions that I've wanted to talk about apostasy laws in Islam, just for the purposes of time. But some questions about how common was it for youth to travel from their home in these two communities? How, according to the martyr text that Awag, we learned from this one particular case, what were the relationships between these two cities? If Christians worked as a subordinate to a Muslim, did this in fact entail that you had to have converted to Islam? What is this public perception that's being represented in the text? Something to talk about. Again, a very intricate case to bring up as a purpose or part of a workshop. And a few other questions. What were the laws about Christian testimony versus Muslim testimony before Qadis? And were there instances which Christians and Muslims had business relations and actually interacted as co-equals in a trade without a perceived form of conversion? So with that, for time purposes, I will leave everything else for questions and answers. Yes.
Hey, thank you so much, Sergio and Ani, for your thought-provoking work. I will refrain, obviously, from providing a synopsis of the presentation, since you were fortunate enough to hear them and be able to read them ahead of time, even. Let me rather propose to spend our time together with some very general and arguably lofty remarks. This is the best I can do as an early modern Europeanist. In the following, I want to relate these papers in order to contribute to our main theme of discussion, how to think through confessionalism in the Armenian tradition. And I will make a distinction between confessionalism and confessionalization. I use confessionalization when I talk about the Reformation period, and confessionalism when I talk about the question whether confession is a useful term in approaching the medieval world that our two speakers have outlined for us. Ani's paper captures a snapshot of a world where the workings of religious confession making are little in evidence. She zooms in on a 14th century martyrological account of Awag, an artisan, a weaver of leather bags and saddles. I love this description. Who was geographically mobile. As a Christian believer, who ended up living in a place where Islam ruled, he was accused of having been also religiously mobile, or an apostate, by a Muslim who claimed to have known him as a fellow Muslim. Sergio's paper, by contrast, scouts out the persistent but discontinuous and contextual workings of confession making. Importantly, he does so over the longue durée, as well as at the seams of other traditions. To my mind, in my reading, Ani's micro-religious and Sergio's macro-religious perspectives overlap and speak to one another powerfully. At any rate, according to the long-term view, the 14th century, the time when Awag the martyr lived and died, was a crucial period in the rupturous formation of the Armenian church. It would be tempting to arrange the two papers as a sequence, a before and after, or a simultaneous contrast. Yet there may be better ways of reading the two papers as a dialogic pairing. And please note that Ani's paper actually doesn't use the term confession. At the core of our panel lies a problem: the difference between religion as practice on the one hand and religion as confession on the other hand, and the question whether and how such a conceptual difference matters. Confession, in the sense invoked here, originated with one text. In 1530, some estates presented the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire with a document outlining their religious positions as they differed from Catholicism. This Confessio Augustana, as it is known after the city of Augsburg, where the diet in question took place, was a statement of faith by those who came to be known as Protestants, the model of many other such confessions in its wake. Confessiones, in sum, are writings. As a genre, they synthesize core beliefs. But as scholars of confessionalization have shown, they were writings in action. That is, they were writings conceived in order to shape the people and the context where they were used and disseminated. In other words, they are texts that accrued social and religious lives and acquired institutional weights, be it in churches, schools, councils, and universities, or through catechization, debates, and other such activities. The question is not alone whether the European Reformations provide a suitable comparison for contexts such as the Armenian Church's history over time. Rather, confessions have shaped our understanding of religion in general, namely religion as an edifice of beliefs. In short, we need to grapple with confession's conceptual afterlife in religious and other historiographies. And Sergio hints at this when he sort of looks at the question of teleology. Significantly, the Armenian case has new perspectives to offer for the classic account of confessionalization. As many practitioners of the confessionalization paradigm would agree, I should be able to pronounce this, right? I've done it before, even today. As many practitioners of the confessionalization paradigm would agree, the linear account of confessional buildup needs to be recast as more contingent. Sergio speaks rightly of a contested and fluid process. He also wonders how confession building worked across a vast space with changing political configurations, something that Ani also points out. And maybe it's precisely this distribution and dispersion that is a reason to confessionalize. And I'm drawing on a world that I know better, when in the late 16th century, refugees from the Netherlands entered and migrated to cities in Westphalia and in West Germany, as we could say, they brought with them a higher level of confessional identity than the populations that they sort of settled with, and thereby promoted or forced others into speeding up confessionalization. So these multi-settings may be very important. In short, while confessiones suggest religious unity, plurality lies at confessionalism's core, or the fear of plurality. Such a plurality, a constellation of religious markers, to cite Sergio's term, proves a good lens for Awag, the martyr. Markers such as dress, profession, professional partnerships, place of residence, etc. The study of Protestantism has redirected much attention to multi-religious contexts in recent years, not unlike our papers are concerned with here. Such contexts with their often asymmetrical distribution of authority, with one confession or religion on top, so to speak, were formative not only through confrontations, conflicts, and polemics. Importantly, such multi-religious milieus also point to the politics of religious cooperation, coexistence, or connectedness in everyday settings. We may grasp these forms of cooperation through the often better documented hostilities, whether in words or in actions. Awag, of course, tragically lost his life, but the text allows for other sort of views on these multi-religious settings. Which archives may lend themselves to deepen and develop such a take on confession, we may ask. First, statements of faith can be read against their intent, which is to provide a united front. In fact, they bear the scars of debates, dissent, and the like. Second, sources that contain traces of everyday settings, such as saints' lives or martyrs' accounts, may provide glimpses into multi-religious settings and their appeal. Third, an exclusive focus on the Armenian church may need to be recast, as both Sergio and Ani propose, to have this particular tradition intersect with others. In all these analytic endeavors, confessionalization may alert us not so much to the profession of religious truth alone, but to the echoes of texts and practices in process, if this process happens only occasionally and haphazardly. In addition, the cast of historical actors needs to be broadened beyond the elites wherever possible. We want or need to complement a top-down or theological model with a multi-directional narrative, including a variety of actors who are not blind subjects, but people with distinct profiles, people such as Awag, even if there is many things we don't know about him. What these two papers, in other words, have us envision is a study of confessionalism that centers on acts, practices, and performances, often in multi-religious settings. With all the particulars of such a perspective, the function of confessionalism would be to keep an eye on tradition, a tradition with an exclamation mark, as well as with a nagging and omnipresent question mark. What I argued for here seeks to make a case for our excellent papers as resonant. What I haven't offered is a set of questions. My comment, however, is meant to provoke further comments, counter-arguments, debate. So please do so. In addition, I have questions directed at the two speakers. For Ani, I'm interested in learning about the textual evidence, and you've started already to give us insights into that. The genre of martyrology, the manuscript's transmission, and how Awag's story differs or does not from similar such stories. For Sergio, I'm wondering whether you can say something about the lexicon with which the Armenian tradition was cast as a confession. What were these confessions' terms and phrases? And another question, when and where does the term natio or nation appear? For both, I wonder whether identity is indeed a useful term for what you propose. It is a term that, to my mind, bridges too easily and readily between individuals and collectives, which is precisely something that confessionalism raises as a problem to study. My Confessio Arboriana has come to a close, rest assured. What I've argued for is that any confession only counts if you, the audience, become part of it through discussing these two wonderful papers. The floor is open. I'll look into the room.
Yeah, I guess we'll start with the questions, or you want to address the questions?
You want to take the question?
No? Oh, yeah, you can do that, yeah.
I don't know.
No,
I think we had a hand up.
Yeah, I mean, it will come up if you want to address it, right? I like this, Sergio, when you kind of spelled it out from the beginning that there's this kind of stereotypical view of preservation of the purity. And this is something that has been discussed in early modern Rome with the Ruthenians, their explanation on their own identity, liturgical identity, a presentation that identity to Rome was that of, well, we have preserved something from the East, and therefore you should listen to us. And Rome buying into that. But it's also interesting to me that from the beginning of printing history of Armenian literature and the primacy of Venice in it, like immediately placing suddenly this crucial moment of what you were bringing out about education and devotion and confession. I'm fascinated what you bring up as an example that from the beginning, the makers of theology, the producers, are extremely open to the West. And this is happening right there in the Middle Ages. While in early modern period, for example, in Muscovy, we have an example of accusation of someone using Greek books that were printed in Venice as tainted with Latinity and heresy. While here you have this fascinating ecclesiastical approach where there is an embrace of theological tradition produced outside, readily translated, and then arming. This is like Japanese during the Meiji Revolution, like looking at the West and saying, no, we're going to take all of that and make ourselves stronger. But I wanted to for you to maybe address more of that uniqueness.
Yeah, I do think it's slightly unique. I mean, it can't be very unique. It is unique, and I gave a talk and I have a paper called Subverting Romanicity, in which I talk about how Armenians translated, on the one hand, yes, to get information. It's clear from the beginning, right? They had to translate the Bible, and then in order to translate the Bible, you needed to know what the Bible meant theologically that was correct. So they translate the church fathers to go with it. And there's this whole apparatus of intellectual hermeneutics to go with that translation process. And that continues on. But at some point, I feel that they also translate to subvert Roman hegemony. And it allows them to operate. And I think Boros is like expressing it the most clearly. I think there are other examples that predate Boros, but when he says it, like, no, we know your stuff, you don't know ours. And so, and crap may have been like the nicer way of putting it. I think it literally means like sheep dung as well. But finding the pearl in the dung, and it plays into various sort of Mediterranean tropes of finding secret knowledge. But I do think that there is an openness from the beginning, and you never really get that closed. Michael, you can you never really get that close thing, like we're not going to read it because it's foreign. There's always that. I mean, there are periods in which translation is much more open than in others. I mean, there's just more of it. But at no point do you ever read. I've never written the sentence saying like that was written by someone else, so we're not going to read it. Like I said, even in the Inquisition, when they're killing actual people, they won't burn the books. Right? They said, oh no, the sermons of St. Augustine are useful, so we'll keep the book. But the people we can get rid of. and so yeah, I don't know what's like other than the fact that they're constantly living in a multilingual society. Right, they're very aware from the beginning of the translated nature of the Bible, and therefore, how can it be a bad thing to do? Right, if you're able to, and here I'll go back to one of my favorite paragraphs in Armenian, which is from the life of Mashtots, the inventor of the Armenian alphabet, when Koryun, his disciple, describes it after they've done the translation. Right, he says that now all of the prophets and like Christ himself and all the apostles are they speak, both Armenian and in the Armenian idiom. So it's not just that we've been able to take these words and make, and we're able to understand them, but now they not only just speak Armenian too. It's not as a translator, they speak in the Armenian idiom, like they do it as an Armenian, right? And so there's that. I think there's that realization of the power of translation into the language that keeps them open to that idea, and also. I think, Michael, you've actually worked about this, about adaptation, right? The ability not just to adopt, but to adapt what you adopt, right? So they take it, and then there's series of steps that also accompany those translations that make them Armenian, so that you often don't feel like you're reading a translated text. So yeah, it is interesting though. You don't see it as much in Syriac, to my knowledge, or the other languages, and clearly, like it's true. Like Greeks, they don't translate anything into Greek and read it because it's going to be beneath them. Right? As if it was really worthwhile reading, it would have been written in Greek. That's like the basic assumption, and that they reject that outright.
Thank you all for a wonderful panel, and I'd like to talk with you more about it over lunch. And thank you, Helmut, too, for your great comments. I just had a quick question for Ani. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about Grigor Kalatetsi, and is this interesting figure who's looking at current events as he's compiling this Martyrology. And if you could talk a little bit more about what is motivating him in Kalat, in his own city, and what sort of fears of plurality are going through his own mind as he's putting together these texts, and how he uses words like Dajik or others, to think about his own community as just another way of opening up the sort of theological relevance and social history of Awag.
Right. Well, thank you for that question, Michael. Grigor Kalatetsi, a martyr himself in 1425. He, again, very mobile in terms of the area too, is very aware of what's happening in the Lake Van region. He's one of the Vartapets who is, I'm being told to speak louder. He's one of the Vartapets, not only is, I cannot say that he's the author of the text, but he's aware of them. He is definitely either editing and compiling them. So for the first time, this handful of martyrologies which the corpus that Awag belongs to is coming to us in Kalatetsi's Heismavurk. And I think if we look at his life, which we don't know a lot about, minus his own martyr text, which is very much not it's almost like a compilation of a biographical, like a vita, that gives us his efforts in not only he served the community at various capacities. And if you've had the chance to read his martyr vita text, it's a very rich representation of what he meant for his community, not only in Kalat, but all around the Lake Van area. The words like Tachik, or I think there is another one in his own text written by one of his students, is the word Isa, which is a later reference of Christ. This is the more Arabic reference. Some of these terms actually speak about the development of how the classical Armenian at this point is really changing. So there is quite a bit of Middle Armenian that's part of not only the terms, but the grammar in these texts. A combination of, I would say, something like 30 to 38 martyr texts coming in this period, depending on which frame we're talking about. So Kalatetsi, of about 50 years of his Vartapedagan, efforts, brings together a way to actually represent what it meant to be an Armenian Christian in the faces of these various challenges. at no point do I discern in his life writings or in his community or someone like his cousin and also co-Vartabed, if you want to put it this way, Mateusz Jurajewski. They're responding to the challenges of their time in a way, but not to sort of create a confessionalized identity that is hard and stone, so to speak. They're really, I think, tapping into, even when we look at the texts they are translating this time, actually, they're translating, it's more of the early Christian texts that they're interested in, whether it's the Desert Fathers or the Church Fathers, the patristics that they're writing. So they're very much about going back to representing how the Christian tradition was passed down to the Armenians in this period, and Khalatetzi is a representative of that. So both in his theological writings or in his High Smavur compilation, I think it comes through that it's not so much about carrying this very hard, like defined lines of this is us versus them sort of representation, but there is really, even in their signatures of what they represent in their virtues, it's the ones of meekness, humility, and sort of embracing the community of that time. And mind you, this isn't the patriarchate, so to speak, right? This isn't a patriarchate see. The Ahtamar is the representative, like the see that they're kind of all belonging to at this point. But the vanks themselves, the monasteries themselves, which Khalatetzi belonged to, a couple of them actually, Zipna Vank, Sukhara Vank, these were all northwest of Lake Van, represented a very, if I may put it, a non-imperial style approach to Christianity, which is a very one of the Armenian treasures to the rest of Christianity and history to engage with. There's a perception of the other that comes through, and the perception of what it means to be Christian in conversation with the other that's not perhaps breaking those sort of more imperial structures. I don't know if that's helpful. Yeah.
Actually, more to that.
Sure.
Thank you so much. So I'm more curious about how narratives about Awag were circulated in centuries later, which periods and which regions, and whether or not, I mean, you might be able to answer, but whether or not there were different interpretations based on the specific relations with non-Christians and Muslims. Like, for example, in the present, is this story being circulated? And is it being circulated in a way that serves or challenges present perceptions of Muslims in Armenia or Armenia?
Thank you. Thank you for your question. Just to also kind of touch on that, Grigor Khalatetzi makes it so that he opens this tradition of the High Smavurk to say, the High Smavurk being the Menologium, the Synaxarion, to say, include your local saints. The Armenian, unlike the Catholic Church, doesn't have some sort of structure to say you have to meet, all these 6 points, and then some 10 years have to go by. There has to be a miracle done for the person to then eventually be canonized. It doesn't work like that. It's a lot more fluid. It's a lot more it's based on the testimony. It's based on that confession. So Khalatetzi actually opens up the High Smavurk for that, which was really criticized by the church and also later on to say it's corrupted really what it means to include people in the compilation of the saints, but not so much for Khalatetzi. He had that openness. He actually brings that, sort of access. So some of these saints that I've very much prioritized in my study are the ones that are local saints. Interestingly, in Khalatetzi's High Smavurk, which is very popular after the 15th century, and that's the one very much copied, it carries over. So all the ones I showed you from the Himmel collection that have come from Zomar, Istanbul, various other collections in the Matenadaran, and also Venice and Vienna, and in France, they all have them. So I think we're looking at something like 2,000 High Smavurks being circulated. And Jacob Manandian and Hrace Ajarian did the study in 1903, which remains somewhat incomplete at the break of the Armenian genocide. So that was a period where they were bringing together these texts for socioeconomic, political studies, and they identified Awag's martyr text is included in their study, and they've identified something like, I want to, citing from memory, over 20 texts from various different copies. But they worked with something like, at the time, 200 Haismavurks. But over the 2000, all the ones that I've looked at, in addition to Hakopanandyan and what Jarian have identified, they are actually in every single one of them. And interesting to also mention, Anavar Zetsi, who is not of the Khalat Hetzi tradition, he is prior to Khalat Hetzi and also made a copy of Haismavurk in a very different, in accordance with the Roman calendar, not the Armenian calendar, includes Awag's martyrdom. So these were texts that spoke to the people, the commoner, about what it meant to be a Christian in their context. It was very accessible. It wasn't just the hierarchy of the church that was able to live a very saintly life. It was also the commoner who can actually relate and be what it is to face these challenges. This is something a little bit more than just the sharp identifiers of politics and religion. This was something about what it meant to be human. And they were able to see that and be inspired by that. It's my interpretation. Yeah.
Just a slightly, yes. I mean, I think with the Haismavurk and the inclusion of these saints, you're right. I think there is a reach out, but I don't think we can, or an outreach, sorry. I don't think we can forget that they're rewriting these lives so that the people don't have the commoner's perspective, but are given the hierarchy's perspective. And I know from the earlier ones where we have the actual original version, when you get to the Haismavurk, they present a very different picture of this person, and it's cleaned up. It's the hierarchy is always involved at some level. I'm not as familiar with Awag's, which is more contemporary with Khalat, so it's a little bit different. But at least with the earlier ones, they do like rewrite it to make sure that the points that they want people to get, right? And I think you're absolutely right about that. They're trying to communicate what's important to them, to everybody, and they know that this is one way of they're using these lives as a tool to reach common people. But for me, the problem is like, what did the common person actually get from that? I don't know. That's where I still like, because I mean, I think they would have obviously there was some resonance, otherwise they wouldn't have done it, right? They would have failed.
I would say whether we can take the text to serve as an archetype versus the actual. So I love to actually do that, which goes back to my original point about meaning making. These texts were not only there, whether I can actually make a very good case about the existence of each one of these individuals. And I think a few other scholars have done so with all the martyrologies I have worked with, but it is a meaning-making text. And what's very important to sort of enter into that frame to allow for the text and the context to speak to us about those things is that at the end, it's really about not only controlling how these identities are made, but they are really tapping into something very deep about what it means to be human, and it is resonating with the average person. I mean, we can read it in our modern lens in a way. We are in many ways, come down from many generations and cultures and peoples. Like my ancestors go back to the very region where these texts come from. In some way, I can actually look at it and think, I'm a modern mind, but there is a lineage that I actually can look back and think, can I actually find meaning in these texts for me even? So can I read it beyond? Yeah.
Can we go over to?
Oh, sorry.
Another 5 minutes? Yeah, 10 minutes? Yeah, 10 minutes. Okay.
But I will, yeah. But at some point, Sergio, definitely I take the meaning making of the texts, yeah.
We have children. I have a rather silly question for Sergio, relating to the question of the Armenian church as a national church. Really a curiosity. Is there any significance in the fact that the Armenian church identified and still identifies itself as Ayastaniites and not Ayots?
Well, I have I've written about like the different, like when they start using Hayastanites, they don't always use Hayastan, and it's not necessarily, it's also like, it can't be broken down to say like in the 5th century, they use this, in the 7th century, there doesn't seem to be consistency when they do that. And they also, you notice, whatever they use, it's a plural, right? It's Hayastanites, Hayots, and the question is whether the Hayastanites then is more linked to a place because you have Hayastan in it as opposed to an ethnicity. It's hard to disentangle when I look through the evidence when they're using those terms to see any sort of linear progression in those terms. But a lot of it, I think also, as you were saying before with the lexicon, I mean, there's the word that they'll use to refer to Armenians other than with their own ethnonym, with Azk, right? An Azk, and that's like one of the hardest words to translate in Armenian, right? Like, what the heck is an Azk? I mean, on the one hand, it could be a tribe, and on the other hand, it could be a nation. There's a lot of room in between for what that means, and who gets to decide who's in the Azk and who's out of the Azk. And do you like, and is it self-defining, right? I mean, as someone says, if you want to say you're Armenian, that's good enough for me, right? Who else wants to do that? And so then we have this real problem, like, and the national church model creates problems because of the fact that it's taking a claim and actually taking it prima facie, right? Okay, because you're the national church, that means what you say represents what the people are. And a lot of the people don't agree with it. And so then where does that, like, is it, I have a real problem with that notion of a national church, because like, as you said, like in the papers, we're talking about the national churches. And then, so what do you do with Armenian Catholics? Are they not Armenian? Or are they not Catholic, right? That's the problem they run into, right? Are you Armenian or are you Catholic? Or it's like, in Fresno, I always get asked the question, are you Catholic or are you Christian? And which still stumps me to this day. I'm like, is that a trick question? And I say, no, I'm Armenian, and so I'm older than all of them. Yeah, so it's, on the one hand, it's not a silly question at all, but it does revolve around notions. And I do want to pivot back to this question about whether the notion of identity is useful or not. And since I've, invested a lot into that sack of tricks, I was just wondering if you could go back to that, because of like, how do we discard this notion of identity, whether it's a national identity, a personal identity, or as I like to put it, identities that are completely contextualized so that one person or one group can assume many different identities depending on the relationships it's entered into.
I think there is a slipperiness to the term. And if we look at, contributions like yours that use identity, discarding my glasses, If we look at academic contributions in history or other fields that use identity, there is a slipperiness, sort of that's is useful for certain contexts, a bridge. But I think, sort of there is, of course, a library out there that critiques, the use of identity, especially in historical context. And I don't even come from that. It's not because of that. It's just, I think that confessionalism, in the way that you want us to think about it, actually raises questions about the way in which one situation is similar to the next one, and what that word identity, when you apply it, even in the plural, can do. So it's not something that I can resolve, but sort of that I want to call attention to, and I think sort of more attention to the ways in which identity is all too useful in writing prose and a narrative and an argument. That might be all that is needed. I'm not inviting you to discard it, but to think about what it does, because identification, that's a very strong claim that is built in.
Now I'm going to stay up.
So I don't think we can get out of that claim, easily. So you have a question, Daniel.
It would take too long.
It would take too long. We have time.
Let's take it into lunch.
Oh,
Let's take the discussion to lunch.
okay, okay. Is that the end, kind of, Vicken says we have arrived at lunchtime.
Wait,
Okay, Rob.
is it about lunch?
Since it just came up, I wasn't really thinking about this question. Question of national church comes after the rise and fall of Schism. Up to the 10th century, I look at this as the Church of Armenia. After the 11th century, I use Armenian Church. They have dispersion. It's no longer compact in Armenia itself, which doesn't mean that there were no Chalcedonians or whatever. That's not the point. And then there comes the Ottoman period when you have your identity is your denominational identity. And that's when Shahinian or whatever comes. That's one. But I had a number of other questions. Very quickly, some very simple. Dr. Ani spoke about Menologion as the Haismavur. To my mind, Menologion is really refers to the briefer, complete but briefer accounts of sects, whatever. Whereas Synaxarion is the larger, more detailed, again the same content but more elaborate. I use Synaxarion, but not Menologion. And this is insignificant. But before I ask you the next question, I have a question for you. How did you qualify Terence's Haismavur? Would this be first or the most important or what?
It was considered the most popular one after his, so it's the fourth edition of the Haismavurs from Israel, Anavarzetzi.
Was the first one you said?
It's there Israel, right?
Yeah, there is.
And before there Israel, there is the collection. I mean, there Israel is working off of collections based off of Bagayas's sort of investigative work throughout the villages.
So, now I understand, because I was going to say that Anavarzetzi is the best, really.
Sure. There are opinions of that. And Anavarzetzi, the difference.
Israel is also
Yes.
very important. They led the way.
They did, yeah. What Khalatetzi did with what Khalatetzi did is he just took that and then made it more on the Armenian calendar. And then he started with the Armenian saints. So it becomes more a Haismavur for the Armenians. And it's not, I mean, their style is too, and so is Anavarzetzi, but they are on the Roman calendar. So then it creates an interesting discourse between Armenian and Catholic relations, even to this day, I would say, which Haismavur do you use? And when Matthews translated into the English, he went with Anavarzetzi.
And about this business of keeping the books and burning the people, I think, I'm sure there will be people who said that, but you should also remember Nersess is saying in his negotiations with the Greeks that what we're saying, ecumenic thought, what we're saying is just that you don't read our language. If you read our language, you would see that we are talking about the same thing.
Right.
That's right.
Yeah,
I think that's something to.
yeah, because she was certain that they weren't going to.
You say that,
That they weren't going to, so like, don't worry, we're saying the same thing.
Yeah.
It's like Photius's like notion on the filioque that the Latins have to add it filioque because Latin is an inferior language to Greek, and so we were saying the same thing.
Yeah.
But
It's a philological disconnect, yeah.
have to give the benefit of the doubt.
So now we're moving to eating the same food.
Yes.
We want to identify.